The door didn't just close on Sarah Mitchell that morning. Slammed. Harold Briggs threw the bolt with both hands, his fat fingers shaking with something that wasn't cold, it was contempt. He looked Sarah dead in the eye through that frost-crusted window, and he smiled before he turned away. 3 little boys standing behind her in the snow. The youngest one, Samuel, was wearing his dead father's coat, the sleeves dragging past his hands, the collar swallowing his chin. And Harold Briggs looked at that child, and he smiled, and he walked to the back of his store and disappeared. If that had been your child standing in that snow, what would you have done? This is the story of a woman this town tried to erase, and the outcast who refused to let them. Before we go any further, if stories like this one reach something in your chest, something real, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories of people who were counted out and came back swinging. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now let's go back to Mercy Creek, Montana, and let's not look away. The morning Sarah Mitchell walked into Mercy Creek with her 3 sons. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees below zero, and the sky had that flat white color that meant more snow before noon. She had been up since 4. Not because Samuel had cried again in his sleep, though he had, and not because the wind was finding new ways through the gaps in the cabin walls, though it was. She was up because she had lain there in the dark, running the numbers in her head, and the numbers kept coming out wrong. They had $17 and some change left. A tin of coffee that was almost out. Half a bag of flour. Some dried beans. The boys were growing, and they were hungry in that deep-down way that doesn't go away with a small meal, the kind of hungry that settles into a child's eyes and makes them quieter than they ought to be. James Mitchell had been dead for 4 months. She still reached for him in her sleep sometimes, still turned to say something to him at the stove, and found nothing there. The grief wasn't dramatic anymore. It had moved past dramatic into something flatter and more permanent, like a stone she carried in her chest everywhere she went. She'd learned not to talk about it. The boys needed her to function, not to fall apart, and she was doing her level best to hold the line between those two things every single day. She dressed carefully that morning, brushed her coat, made sure her boots were clean. She told herself it didn't matter what she looked like when she walked into Briggs General's store, that Harold Briggs was a businessman, and businesses needed customers, and she was a customer with money in her pocket. She told herself that. She didn't entirely believe it. The boys walked beside her the whole 3 miles into town. Daniel, who was 14, and already trying to grow into the man of the house in ways that worried her too serious, too watchful, jaw always set a little too tight. Marcus, who was 11 and had his father's tendency to talk through everything, to fill silence with words, like he was afraid of what lived in the quiet. And Samuel, 7 years old. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since the funeral, and the doctor in Billings had said, give him time, that sometimes children went quiet when the world hurt too much, that he'd come back when he was ready. Sarah gave him time every single day and prayed he'd come back soon. They came into town just after 8 in the morning. The street was quiet, most of the storefronts still dark. A few men outside the feed yard looked up and then looked away. One woman Sarah recognized, Clara Hofstede, who used to bring pie to church gatherings, crossed to the other side of the street without a word. Sarah felt it, but she kept walking. She had gotten better at keeping her face still. Briggs General Store had a lamp burning in the window. She could see Harold through the glass, moving behind the counter, arranging something on a shelf. She pushed the door open, and the bell above it rang, and Harold turned around. His face changed. Not dramatically, not with anger exactly. It was something colder than anger. It was the look of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the moment to enforce it. He didn't say hello. He didn't say good morning. He looked at her, and then he looked past her at the 3 boys coming through the door, and something moved behind his eyes. Mrs. Mitchell, he said. His voice was flat. Good morning, Harold. She kept her voice even. She pulled her list from her coat pocket. She'd written it out the night before carefully. Only what they absolutely needed. I need to put together a small order. I have cash. Most of its windows were dark. Harold didn't move from behind his counter. He put his hands flat on the wood and looked at her in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. I heard you've been having some trouble out at your place, he said. We're managing fine, thank you. That right. It wasn't a question. He picked something up from the counter, a ledger, maybe, or just something to hold and set it down again. Thing is, Sarah, I've been talking with some folks, and the feeling around town is that your situation out there, a woman alone, 3 kids, no husband, it's not stable. She felt Daniel go still beside her. I don't know what that has to do with buying flour, she said. Well, Harold shifted his weight. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed this, who had told himself it was reasonable, who had made peace with it ahead of time. I've decided I can't extend credit to your account anymore. I'm not asking for credit. I have cash. Even so, he said it slowly, like the words were explanations in themselves. Even so, I think it's better if I think it'd be better for everyone if you made other arrangements. The store was warm. There was a small stove in the corner, and she could smell coffee and tobacco and the particular dusty smell of dry goods. Samuel had moved up close to her side without her noticing, his small shoulder pressing against her leg. Harold, she said carefully, my children need to eat. I understand that. But I've got a business to think about. And there's people in this town who feel a certain way about the example being set. Woman out there alone, no proper oversight, no man of the house. My husband died. Her voice was harder now. She couldn't help it. He didn't leave. He died. I'm aware of that. Harold's jaw shifted. I'm sorry for your loss. I am. But the situation is what it is, and I think you'd be better served looking to your own people. Or, we are my people, she said. My sons and I, we are each other's people. A long moment. Harold looked at the counter. Then he walked to the door, reached past her, and threw the bolt. She stood there. For a second, she didn't understand what he'd done. Then she did. He had locked them in no. He had locked other people out. He had locked her in as a private conversation, not a customer, not a woman with money in her pocket and hungry children at her side, but a problem to be managed behind closed doors. I think you should head on out now, he said, through the back. Save everyone the trouble. Daniel made a sound beside her, not words. Just a sound low in his throat, the sound of a 14-year-old boy learning something about the world that he would never unlearn. We'll go out the front, Sarah said. She took Samuel's hand. She looked at Harold Briggs one more time, really looked at him, the way you look at something you want to remember exactly, and then she unbolted the door herself and walked her sons back out into the cold. Nobody said anything for half a block. Marcus was the one who broke it, because Marcus always broke silence, because he couldn't help it, because he was 11, and the world kept doing things he needed to understand. Why'd he do that, Mama? Because he's scared, she said. Of us? She thought about that. Of anything that doesn't fit his idea of how things ought to be. Daniel didn't say anything. He walked with his hands in his pockets, and his jaw in that position she was learning to hate, clenched, set, the jaw of a boy deciding to swallow something instead of letting it out. She'd talk to him about it later. Or she'd try. They were nearly to the edge of town when Reverend Clayton stepped out from the side of the church. He was a tall man, narrow, with a gray beard that he kept immaculate, and he had a way of positioning himself in your path that felt less like coincidence and more like statement. Sarah. He nodded at her. Boys, Reverend. She kept walking. He fell into step beside her. I heard Harold had some concerns. I imagine Harold's concerns spread quickly. People talk, he paused. Sarah, I want to be frank with you. There's been discussion among the congregation about what's right, about what's proper. A woman in your situation alone, without guidance. She stopped walking. Daniel bumped into her from behind. She felt Samuel's hand tighten around her fingers. I want to be frank with you too, Reverend, she said. She kept her voice quiet because she knew how quiet could cut further than loud. I have been in that cabin for 4 months. It is 11 degrees outside. My youngest son has not spoken in months. I walked 3 miles this morning to buy food with money I earned. And what I am hearing from this town, from Harold, from you, from every person who crossed the street before I could say good morning, is that the problem isn't the cold. The problem isn't the hunger. The problem is me. Clayton's jaw worked. Now, I wouldn't characterize it. How would you characterize it? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the snow. Then he said, we worry about the example being set. A woman without a husband trying to run a homestead. My husband is dead. I know that. Then stop saying I'm without a husband like it's a choice I made. She walked away. She felt his eyes on her back. but she didn't turn around. Her heart was hammering, and her face was hot despite the cold, and she was doing that thing she'd learned to do, that terrible necessary thing where you feel everything and show nothing and keep your legs moving. The wagon rode back toward their cabin, forked a quarter-mile from the church. She pulled up short because there was a man standing in the road. She'd seen him before in the way you see someone in a small territory without really seeing them at the edge of things, not quite part of the furniture of the town. Wyatt Cole. She knew the name. People mentioned him the way they mentioned things they weren't quite sure what to do with. He'd come through a couple of years back, bought a small claim at the edge of the valley, kept to himself mostly. His wife had died. She remembered hearing that. He had a daughter. He didn't come to church. She had the sudden exhausted thought that she did not have the energy for whatever this was. He was holding a paper bag. When he saw her coming, he didn't move out of the road, but he didn't position himself in it the way Clayton had either. He just stood there like a man who'd been waiting and was a little unsure now that the moment had arrived. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said. "Mr. Cole," she stopped. The boys arranged themselves behind her. She could feel Daniel watching. Wyatt Cole was somewhere in his early 40s, she thought. Sandy-haired, weathered in the way that men got weathered out here, not beaten, exactly, but marked. He had the look of someone who'd carried things and put them down and picked them back up again and figured out over time that complaining about the weight didn't change it. "I saw what happened," he said. "At the store." She waited, sighed. He shifted his weight. "I wasn't trying to be in your business. I was there." And he held out the bag. "I picked up what you needed." She stared at it. For a moment, she felt something rise in her chest that she absolutely could not afford to feel in the middle of a road in front of her children. She pressed it back down. "I don't take charity," she said. "That's not charity." His voice was direct. Not unkind, but not soft either. "I'm not offering charity, I'm offering—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "I've got a proposition, if you want to hear it." Daniel stepped up beside her. 14 years old, trying to look like 17. "My mother said she doesn't take charity." Wyatt looked at Daniel. Something passed between them, some recognition that didn't have words yet, man to almost man. A look that took the measure of something. "I heard her," Wyatt said. "I said it's not charity." "Then what is it?" Sarah asked. He took a breath, let it out slow in the cold air. "I know how to build things. I've got tools, and I know how to use them. I heard your barn's in bad shape, one of the Paulson boys mentioned it. And I can see for myself that you walked 3 miles in below zero cold to get turned away from a store." He paused. "My claim's doing okay. Not great, but okay. And I could use I've got work I can't do alone. My daughter's 8 years old and she does what she can, but there's a limit." Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm not asking to run anything. I'm not asking for anything that's yours. I'm saying 2 struggling outfits might do better than 2 struggling outfits doing it separately." The wind came through, and they all felt it, all 5 of them. Standing in that road, the mother and her 3 boys and this man, with his bag of supplies and his proposition. Sarah looked at him for a long time. She was trying to read him, trying to find the angle, the hidden thing, the part of this, that would eventually cost something she couldn't afford. She'd learned in the months since James died that kindness from men usually came wrapped around something else, an expectation, a debt. A slow assumption of control, delivered gently at first and less gently later. But his hands were still holding out that bag. Not pushing, just holding. "What's in it?" she asked. He blinked. Then he looked at the bag like he'd almost forgotten. Flour, coffee, some dried beef, tinned tomatoes, a beet. "I guessed on the coffee. You might have your own preferences." Something almost escaped her face. She caught it. "I'll hear the proposition," she said. "At the cabin. Not here." He nodded. "Fair enough." They walked in an odd kind of convoy, Sarah and her 3 boys, Wyatt Cole a careful few steps back, not presuming to walk beside her, not hanging back in a way that seemed like a statement. Just there, taking up a reasonable amount of space and no more. Marcus looked over his shoulder at him twice. The 3rd time, Wyatt caught him looking, and instead of ignoring it or making a face, he just looked back, plain and honest. Marcus faced forward again and didn't look back after that. Samuel walked the whole way with his hand in Sarah's, silent as always. But somewhere around the 2nd mile, she felt his grip change slightly, not tighter, not looser. Something else. like he'd noticed something and was thinking about it. She didn't know what he was thinking. She rarely did these days. She knew what she was thinking. She was thinking, I have $17 and a dying barn and 3 sons in winter coming harder every day. I have a town that just locked its doors and a reverend who thinks my survival is an inappropriate example. I have nothing to lose except the boys and the land, and those I will not lose. I will not. And she was thinking one other thing, a thing she wouldn't say out loud, a thing she barely admitted to herself. Don't let this be another thing that costs me more than I have. Cabin came into view around the bend, gray and stubborn against the white landscape. Smoke barely trickling from the chimney because she'd banked the fire, low to save wood. It looked small. It looked cold. It looked like a place where a woman and her children were fighting something much bigger than themselves. Wyatt Cole stopped walking for just a second when he saw it. She caught it from the corner of her eye, not judgment, not the look that said, no wonder they need help. Just a look that said, yes, I see what this is. I understand now what I'm looking at. Then he kept walking. They went inside out of the cold, and Sarah put the kettle on, because that was what you did, because some habits were armor, and she needed all the armor she could get. The boys crowded around the stove. Samuel sat in the chair closest to it, the one that had been James's chair, and stared at nothing in particular. Wyatt Cole stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands and waited. She poured 2 cups of the last of the coffee. She sat down across the table from him. She said, talk. And something in the room shifted some weight, some balance into a shape she couldn't yet name, but that felt, very carefully, very cautiously, like the first thread of something that might hold. He talked for about 20 minutes. He didn't oversell it. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men, when they wanted something, built it up, made it sound grander than it was, smoothed the edges down, painted over the cracks. Wyatt Cole talked like a man who was tired of pretending things were easier than they were. He laid it out plain. His claim had a decent structure, better than hers, but he was down to 1 horse, and the animal was getting old. He had fencing that needed work before spring. His daughter Emma had been doing the cooking since she was 6. And that wasn't right. He knew it wasn't right, but there hadn't been another option. He could build. He could repair. He knew livestock. What he didn't have was enough hands or enough hours in the day. He didn't say he was lonely, but it was there, underneath, the way cold was underneath everything in Montana in February. So sickly Sinky Pete. Sarah listened without interrupting. She'd learned that from James, that the most useful thing you could do when someone was talking was to actually hear them, not just wait for your turn. She watched Wyatt's hands while he talked. Carpenter's hands, scarred across the knuckles, 1 finger that had healed crooked from some old break. Hands that had actually done things. When he finished, she asked him 3 questions. The first was whether he expected to be fed for his labor. He said no, he'd bring his own provisions and split whatever they produced fairly. The second was whether he expected any claim on her land or her decisions about the land. He looked almost offended. No, he said, it's yours. The third question she asked quietly, because the boys were listening, even though they were pretending not to. What do you want out of this, really? Not practically. What do you actually want? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. I want Emma to grow up somewhere that doesn't feel like we're just holding on, he said. That's all. That's the whole of it. She believed him. She wasn't sure she should believe him, but she did. All right, she said. We'll try it. 3 weeks. If it's not working for either of us, we say so, and that's the end of it. He nodded. 3 weeks. He left before dark, said he'd be back in the morning with tools, and Emma, and he was. Sarah wasn't sure she'd slept much. She'd lain in the dark, running through all the ways this could go wrong. He could be manipulative, controlling, could make himself indispensable, and then use that as leverage, could be kind to her face and cruel to her boys when she wasn't watching. She'd seen that happen to women. She'd seen what it looked like, and she knew the shape of it, but she'd also seen the way he'd looked at the cabin, not with pity, with recognition. He arrived at 7 the next morning with a horse-drawn sled loaded with lumber and tools, and beside him on the seat was Emma Cole, who was 8 years old and had her father's same steady eyes, and a quantity of dark hair that had clearly not been properly dealt with in some time. She was wearing a coat that was too big for her, and boots that were probably a size too large, and she sat beside her father like a person who was used to going places and figuring things out when she got there. Sarah watched Samuel watching Emma from the doorway. Emma jumped off the sled before it had quite stopped and looked directly at Samuel and said, "Do you like dogs?" "We don't have one, but I've been thinking about dogs." Samuel stared at her. "I'm Emma," she said. "What's your name?" Samuel looked at Sarah. Sarah gave him nothing, just waited. The way she always waited. The way the doctor had said to wait. "Samuel," he said. So quietly it was barely a sound. Emma accepted this, like it was a normal volume of speech. "Samuel's a good name. You want to see what's in my bag? I brought things." She walked past him into the cabin without being invited, and Samuel, after a moment's pause, followed her. Wyatt had watched this from the sled. He picked up a hammer. "She does that," he said. "Just decides things are fine and acts like they're fine until they usually are. Does it work?" He thought about it. More than you'd expect. The first week was awkward in the way that all arrangements between strangers are awkward. Everyone performing a slightly more careful version of themselves. Everyone watching for signals. Everyone waiting to see what the real version of the other person looked like. Wyatt showed up every morning. He assessed the barn with the methodical attention of someone who'd done this kind of work for years, walking the perimeter twice, pressing on boards, testing joints, making small sounds under his breath that weren't quite words. He wrote things in a small notebook. He didn't share everything he notebook. He didn't share everything suspect, because she didn't share everything she was thinking either. Daniel watched him from a distance at first. He had that particular 14-year-old wariness that was half protective instinct and half something else. Something harder to name. Something that had to do with a dead father and a boy who'd been trying to stand in a man's space since October and wasn't sure how he felt about someone coming along who could actually fill it. On the third day, Wyatt was working on the east wall of the barn, and he needed someone to hold a board steady while he drove the nails. Marcus was nearby, but Marcus had the attention span of a sparrow, and Wyatt knew better than to trust a critical structural moment to someone who might wander off mid-sentence. He looked at Daniel. "I need a second set of hands," he said. Not as a request, not as an invitation, just as a statement of fact. Daniel came over. He held the board. He held it well steady, pressure at the right points, adjusting without being told when Wyatt shifted angle. Wyatt noticed. He didn't make a production of it. He just said, "Good," and moved to the next nail. They worked like that for 2 hours without much conversation, which turned out to be its own kind of conversation. Emma, during that first week, became something Sarah could only describe as a system she arrived. Each morning, with her father, immediately located Samuel and proceeded to fill whatever silence he left with a steady, cheerful, completely unself-conscious stream of thoughts about animals and interesting rocks and things she'd read in a book she'd found in her father's trunk, and questions about the farm and observations about the sky. She didn't seem to require Samuel to respond much. She'd pause, look at him, wait a reasonable amount of time, then continue, like she'd decided the conversation was happening regardless, and he was welcome to participate at whatever level felt right. By the end of the first week, Samuel had said approximately 40 words, more than he'd said in any previous week since October. Sarah noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She just noticed. The barn was the first real project. Wyatt had assessed it thoroughly that first morning, and his conclusion, delivered without drama, was that 2 of the load-bearing posts needed to be replaced before the roof was going to be trustworthy through another Montana winter. The east wall had to come down and go back up correctly, and the doors needed to be rehung from scratch because whoever had hung them originally had done it in a way that suggested they'd either been in a tremendous hurry or had simply not cared. "James built that barn," Sarah said. She said it without thinking and then wished she hadn't, because now she'd have to deal with whatever came next. Wyatt paused. "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to. It doesn't mean anything about him. Sometimes buildings settle wrong. Ground shifts. It's not a character statement." She looked at him. "I figure you're worried I'm about to tell you everything your husband built was inadequate," he said. "I'm not. I'm just telling you what needs fixing. Are you always this direct? Usually wastes less time." She found she couldn't argue with that. The work was loud and physical and utterly consuming in a way she hadn't expected to feel grateful for. When you were pulling nails and stacking lumber and figuring out which boards could be saved and which were past it, You didn't have a lot of space in your head for grief or fear or the sound of Harold Briggs' bolt sliding home. You were just doing the next thing. There was comfort in the next thing. She'd forgotten that. The boys worked too. All three of them, in ways appropriate to their ages. Marcus fetching and carrying and asking questions that sometimes distracted everyone and sometimes, accidentally, were genuinely useful. Daniel lifting and holding and watching everything Wyatt did with that quiet, focused attention that was either going to make him a craftsman or an engineer. Someday, she couldn't tell which yet. And Samuel, who mostly stayed near Emma, but occasionally drifted close to where the real work was happening and watched with large, dark eyes. On the 6th day, Wyatt was up on the roof, dealing with a section that had been patched badly the previous year, and Daniel was on the ladder handing up tools when the ladder shifted on the icy ground. Not catastrophically, just enough that Daniel grabbed for the barn wall and his hand slipped and he came down 3 rungs fast and hit the frozen ground on his hands and knees. He sat there for a second. His palms were bleeding. Sarah started forward from where she'd been working, but Wyatt got down from the roof faster than seemed reasonable and was beside Daniel before she reached him. He crouched down at the boy's level, looked at the hands, not fussing, just assessing. "Can you make a fist?" he asked. Daniel tried, winced, made the fist. "Nothing broken," Wyatt said. "Hurt like hell, though." "I'm fine," Daniel said, too quickly. "You don't have to be fine. You can say it hurts." That Daniel looked up at him. That look wary, complicated, something moving behind it that was mostly about a 14-year-old boy trying to figure out who this man was and what he was allowed to feel about it. "It hurts," he said. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "It does." He stood up, offered Daniel a hand, pulled him to his feet. "Let's get you cleaned up. Then we'll look at the ladder. The feet need something on them. Should have dealt with that already. That's on me." He said it without self-flagellation, without making it dramatic. Just, "That's on me. The ladder needs fixing." Sarah watched Daniel absorb this. The admission of responsibility without the theater of guilt. She could see Daniel filing it away somewhere, adding it to whatever he was building in his head about who Wyatt Cole was. She went back to what she was doing, but she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Just slightly. It was not a smooth arrangement. She wanted to be honest about that because life was not smooth, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. There were days Wyatt showed up, and the energy was just wrong, tired, or troubled. Something heavy sitting on him that he didn't explain, and she didn't ask about, and those days they mostly worked in parallel, without much conversation, and that was its own kind of understanding. There was a Tuesday in the second week, where Marcus broke a tool not badly, but it cracked, and Wyatt's jaw tightened in a way that Marcus saw, and Marcus went very quiet, and Sarah stepped in between them and said, "It was an accident," in a tone that was not a question, and Wyatt pulled a breath and said, "I know." "I'm sorry, Marcus. Tools break." And Marcus, who forgave things quickly the way children could, went back to what he was doing within 5 minutes. But Sarah held on to that moment, held it up and examined it, because it told her something. Tightened jaw, the apology, the control he'd had to exercise. He had a temper somewhere under there. Not a cruel one, she didn't think, but it was there. She told herself to remember it, keep her eyes open. Wyatt had his own observations. He was watching her in the same careful way she was watching him. He was just quieter about it. He saw the way she managed the boys, the constant low-level calculation of a woman who had too many things to hold at once, and was always making sure the most important ones didn't drop. He saw the way she moved through exhaustion, not dramatically, not complainingly, just by adjusting to the available power and continuing. He had known people who worked hard. He had not known many who worked with that particular quality of quiet stubbornness, that refusal to frame struggle as anything other than just the next thing that needed doing. He thought about his wife sometimes in those early days at the Mitchell place, not obsessively, just the way Griefy showed up in corners, when your hands were busy and your mind got a moment to wander. Ellen had been different from Sarah. Softer, maybe, or maybe just different, not better or worse. Just a different way of meeting the world. She'd been sick for a long time before she died. Long enough that her death had been a kind of mercy and also the worst thing he'd ever lived through, those two things existing simultaneously without canceling each other out. Emma barely remembered her now. That was the thing that still reached up and grabbed him sometimes, that his daughter was growing up with a ghost of a mother, a collection of stories, and a photograph. And things Wyatt tried to tell her, and whether those things were enough, he genuinely didn't know. Emma, for her part, had no such complicated feelings about the Mitchell household. She simply liked it there. She liked the noise. The Mitchells were louder than she, and her father Marcus in particular, creating a near-constant ambient sound of commentary and questions. She liked Samuel, who she had decided was her specific person in that uncomplicated way children sometimes decided things. She liked Sarah, who talked to her like someone who expected her to understand things and wasn't surprised when she did. One afternoon in the second week, she and Samuel were sitting in the corner of the half-rebuilt barn while the adults and Daniel worked on the east wall. Emma had found a piece of charcoal somewhere and was drawing on a flat board, not anything in particular, just shapes. She handed it to Samuel. He looked at it, took the charcoal, started drawing. He drew for 15 minutes without stopping. A house. People in front of it, small stick figures, but deliberate. A man and a woman and children, the shapes careful even in their simplicity. Emma looked at it. "Is that your family?" she asked. Samuel looked at the drawing for a long time. He pointed to the tallest figure. "That was my dad," he said. Full sentence. Complete. More words than he'd said in a row in months. Emma nodded. "Mine too," she said. "Well, he's not gone. But we don't have Mom anymore." She paused. "It's really different when they're gone." "Yeah," said Samuel. They sat together with that for a while, neither of them trying to fix it, just sitting with it the way children sometimes could, with a directness that adults had mostly lost. Sarah was on the other side of the wall. She heard it. She didn't say anything. She drove another nail and kept working and let the moment be what it was. The end of the second week brought trouble that had nothing to do with lumber or frostbite or a cracked tool. Warren Kent's man showed up on a Wednesday. His name was Aldrich, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and the careful manner of someone who'd spent years delivering unpleasant news on someone else's behalf and had learned to make it sound reasonable. He arrived on a well-fed horse while Sarah and Wyatt were taking stock of the remaining building materials, and he tipped his hat and said good morning and asked to speak with Mrs. Mitchell privately. Wyatt looked at Sarah. She gave him a small nod. He went to find something to do on the other side of the property, close enough that he could see, but not hear. Aldrich had papers. He handled them with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that the packaging of bad news mattered almost as much as the news itself. Warren Kent, he explained, held a note on the property. Had Sarah's husband borrowed money from Kent? She had known. James had told her about it before he died, told her it was manageable. 2 more good seasons, and they'd be clear. 2 good seasons hadn't happened. The note had come due. Kent was prepared to be reasonable. He had a proposal. She took the papers. She read them. She had to read the key section twice. Warren Kent was offering to forgive the debt entirely, clear the note, and provide additional security for the winter. In exchange, he wanted the land, and he wanted Sarah to marry him. She stood in the snow with those papers, and the cold going right through her coat, and she thought, there it is. There's the thing I knew was coming without knowing what shape it would take. "He's a fair man," Aldrich was saying. "He admires you. He says you're a woman of considerable strength. And tell Mr. Kent," she said carefully, "that I am not a transaction." Aldrich stopped talking. "Tell him I received his proposal and I decline it. Both parts of it." Aldrich's expression shifted into something that was professionally neutral but had concern underneath. "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't think you fully appreciate the position. I appreciate it completely." She handed the papers back to him. "Thank you for riding out." He hesitated. He looked at the cabin, at the half-finished barn, at the evidence of work being done and life being lived. He seemed to be trying to decide whether to say something further. Then he tucked the papers back under his arm, tipped his hat, and rode away. Wyatt appeared from around the side of the property. He hadn't approached until Aldrich was off the land. He stood with her for a moment, watching the horse disappear down the road. "Kent?" he said. "Kent." He said nothing else for a moment. "Then how bad is it?" she told him. She told him the whole thing, the note, the amount, the timeline, the proposal. She hadn't planned to tell him all of it, but she found she was tired of carrying things alone, and he'd asked a direct question, and there was something about Wyatt Cole that made you answer direct questions directly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood there with his arms crossed, not looking at her, but out at the road where Aldrich had gone, and his face had the tight, quiet look of a man doing math that was coming out worse than he wanted. "How long do you have?" he said. 6 weeks. Maybe 8 if I can get him to negotiate. Can you get him to negotiate? I don't know. He didn't strike me as a man who negotiates. Wyatt turned to look at her. We need to make money, he said. Not a little. Enough to put a real dent in that note. Enough that he can't call it a total loss if he pushes further. I know that. Have you thought about your preserves? You mentioned them. The ones you used to sell. She had mentioned them. Offhand, one morning when she'd been putting up the last of the summer's wild berries. She hadn't thought he'd filed it away. I haven't had time to do them in volume, she said, and I'd need more jars. More sugar. Capital I don't have. What if you did? What if we sorted the capital? She looked at him. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we figure it out, he said. Not theoretically. Actually. Starting tomorrow. It wasn't a grand speech. He didn't promise her anything. He said we figure it out, like it was a simple and obvious thing, like the we was already established, already assumed. She didn't point this out, but she heard it. That night, after the boys were in bed, and the cabin was quiet, Sarah sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil and started working numbers. Hours available. Berries in the cellar. Jars they had, jars they'd need. Price she could realistically ask per jar. Volume required. It was slow, frustrating arithmetic that kept coming out short, and she erased and started over twice. She had not asked for this situation. She had not asked to be widowed at 36, to be left with 3 boys and a failing homestead, and a debt to a man like Warren Kent, to have her town turn its back on her and then have a stranger show up in the road, offering something that might be help, or might be another version of the same trap she was trying to escape. She had not asked for any of it, but here was the paper. Here were the numbers. She kept working. Downstairs, Samuel was asleep. But before he'd gone to bed, before she'd come downstairs and found him almost smiling, which she hadn't seen in so long, she'd almost forgotten what it looked like he'd shown her, the drawing he'd done in the barn, the figures in front of the house. She'd studied it carefully. Tallest figure, his father. 3 smaller ones, the boys. A woman she assumed was herself. And at the edge of the paper, added in a slightly different pressure of charcoal, newer than the rest, 2 more figures. Smaller. One slightly taller than the other. She hadn't said anything about it. She'd said the drawing was beautiful, which it was, and she'd helped him to bed. But she lay awake for a long time after, thinking about a 7-year-old boy who had said almost nothing for months and had nonetheless drawn, carefully and deliberately, a picture of a family that had gotten larger. She told herself not to read too much into it. She told herself it was a child's drawing and nothing more. She was not entirely convincing. By the 3rd week, the barn was beginning to look like a barn again. The east wall was up, solid and true, and Wyatt had taken Daniel up on the roof to teach him how to check pitch and fix, flashing around the chimney-adjacent sections, and Sarah could hear them up there, Wyatt's low voice, patient but not babying, and Daniel's responses, which were getting gradually less clipped, less defended, more like the actual voice of an actual person who was starting to trust the situation enough to be himself in it. She watched this carefully. She watched it the way you watch a wound that might be healing with hope and with the knowledge that hope could be wrong, with gratitude for the current evidence and wariness about counting on it. She'd started the preserves in real volume now. She'd sent Marcus into town twice with a small amount of money she'd scraped together not to Briggs' store. She would not set foot in Briggs' store, but to the smaller dry goods operation 2 miles further on, run by a quiet Finnish man named Aro, who hadn't participated in the town's verdict on her, and who sold her sugar and jars at fair prices without comment. Preserve operation took over the kitchen table from 3 in the afternoon until late at night. She'd gotten Daniel to help her label the jars in his careful printing. She'd set Emma and Samuel to stirring when the batches needed it, which had the side effect of giving the 2 of them a job to do together, which had the further side effect of Samuel talking more than he'd talked in months, mostly instructions about stirring technique delivered with considerable seriousness. She sent the first 12 jars to a general store who rode there with Wyatt east through Marcus and came back with money in his pocket and a message from the storekeeper that he'd take everything she could make. She sat with that for a moment when Marcus told her everything she could make. She could make a great deal. Wyatt found her in the kitchen at 10 o'clock that night, still working, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before saying, "You should sleep." "Probably, but you're not going to." "Probably not." He came in and sat down at the table. Without asking, he picked up a knife and started cutting the next batch of fruit. They worked like that for an hour, not saying much, the kitchen warm from the stove and the night silent outside, and it was one of those strange moments of peace that you couldn't plan for and wouldn't remember to be grateful for until much later. Grateful for it now. "Kent's going to push harder," Wyatt said, not looking up from what he was doing. "I know. He won't like being told no, I know that too. When he dozed. When he does, I'll be here. Whatever that's worth." She looked at him across the table. His face was just his face, no performance in it, no angle she could see. Just a man who was tired and still working, who'd said what he meant in the fewest words it took to mean it. "It's worth something," she said. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Preserves cooled in their jars in long, careful rows, each one representing an hour of her night, an hour she was using instead of letting Kent use it for her. The barn stood solid on the east wall now, all that work made permanent by cold and nails, and two people who had decided, in their separate, exhausted ways, that permanent things were worth building. She didn't know what was coming. She knew Kent wasn't done. She knew the town wasn't going to transform overnight into something kind. She knew the winter had more left in it, and the numbers still didn't fully add up, and there were a dozen things that could still go wrong. But the jars were there. The wall was up. Samuel had drawn two more figures at the edge of his picture. She kept working. Warren Kent came himself the next time. No Aldrich. No papers held out with practiced neutrality. Just Kent on a black horse that cost more than Sarah's entire homestead, riding up the road on a Thursday morning like a man who had decided that sending representatives was beneath the seriousness of the matter. She saw him coming from the kitchen window. She'd learned to read distance on that road. The way a figure moved told you who it was before you could see a face. Kent moved like money, like a man who had never once in his adult life considered that he might not be welcome somewhere. Wyatt was on the roof of the barn. She didn't call to him. She went outside and stood on the porch and waited. Kent was somewhere past 50, broad across the shoulders in a way that had probably been muscle once and was now just mass. He had a face that might have been handsome's in a harder version of the word all angles and authority, the kind of face that expected to be listened to. He dismounted without hurrying, tied his horse to the fence post like it was his fence, and walked toward her. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "you look well, Mr. Kent?" He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked around at the barn, the new east wall visible from where he stood, the organized stacks of lumber that hadn't been there a month ago. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes moved carefully. "You've been busy," he said. "Always." He looked back at her. "I heard you turn down my proposal." Aldrich delivered the message. He did. Kent put one boot on the bottom porch step. Not climbing, just occupying. "I want you to understand that I made that offer in good faith. It wasn't an insult. I have considerable respect for what you've tried to do out here. I understand that's how you meant it," she said. "My answer is still no." His jaw shifted just slightly. "Sarah?" "Mrs. Mitchell." Pause, he recalibrated. "Mrs. Mitchell, the note comes due in 5 weeks. I'm trying to offer you a way through this that doesn't end with your boys watching their mother lose everything. I appreciate your concern for my boys," she said. "I'll handle the note." "With what?" The question landed hard because he meant it to. He had looked if its windows were dark. He had looked at the numbers she knew he had. Men like Kent always looked at the numbers, and he knew what 5 weeks looked like against what she had. "That's my business," she said. Kent was quiet for a moment. He looked past her at the cabin door, then back at her face. He had the look of a man deciding which version of himself to deploy next. "You've got Cole working your land," he said. "Mr. Cole is helping rebuild the barn." "Yes." "Cole's not a man with much standing in this valley," Kent said. "You know what they say about him. I know what people say. People also said things about me." Something moved in Kent's face. not anger something more calculated than anger. I'm going to be straight with you. I didn't ride out here to argue. I rode out here because I think you're a smart woman making an emotional decision, and I thought if we talked face to face, you might see the situation more clearly. I see it very clearly, she said. You hold a note on my land. That note comes due. You'd like me to surrender both the land and my independence in exchange for clearing it. I'm telling you, I'll clear the note another way. And if you can't, then we deal with that when we get there. He studied her. A long moment, the kind men used to make women feel examined. 5 weeks, he said. He took his boot off the step. I hope you know what you're doing. He mounted his horse and rode away, and she stood on the porch until the road was empty, and then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had gone slightly unreliable. Wyatt was beside her a minute later. He'd come down from the roof quietly. He sat on the step below hers and looked at the road and didn't say anything right away. How much of that did you hear? She asked. Most of it. She nodded. 5 weeks is tight, he said. I know. But it's not impossible. She looked at him. You don't know that. No, he agreed. I don't. He picked up a wood chip from the step, turned it over in his fingers. But I know what we've made in 3 weeks, and I know what you can do when you decide to do something. He looked at her sideways. I've been watching. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. So she stood up and went back inside and started planning. The plan that took shape over the next 3 days was not elegant. It was the kind of plan that worked if everything held together and fell apart badly, if anything went wrong, which was to say it was the only kind of plan available to people without resources or margin. They mapped it out at the kitchen table, after the boys were in bed. Sarah would triple her preserve production, which meant buying more supplies on credit from Aro, a risk she hadn't wanted to take but was going to have to. Wyatt would take on 2 construction jobs he'd been offered in the spring. A rancher named Galbraith needed a new equipment shed, and the schoolhouse in the next township needed foundation work. Daniel would help him on the jobs on weekends, which meant real wages for real work. Marcus would take over some of the preserve labor to free Sarah's hours. Even Emma contributed, spending 3 afternoons a week helping Sarah organize and label, working with the focused efficiency of a child who had learned early that labor was just part of life, and there was no point being dramatic about it. It was a lot. It was too much, probably. The arithmetic still came up short when Sarah ran it on paper, and she ran it multiple times because she kept hoping she was wrong, and she wasn't. We're $400 short, she said, even if everything works perfectly. Wyatt looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. I have money, he said. No. Sarah, I said no. She kept her voice level. I won't owe you money on top of everything else. That's how I've seen how that goes. You're helping me enough. It's not charity, I know it's not. I know you don't mean it that way. She met his eyes. But if I take your money, then I owe you. And I can't, I need this to be mine. I need to fix this myself. Do you understand that? He held her gaze. I understand it, he said. I don't fully agree with it. You don't have to agree with it. He let it go. She noticed that he let it go, didn't push, didn't circle back to it later, didn't try to sneak it in from a different angle. He just accepted her decision and moved on. She stored this information away, alongside the tightening Sitsinsint and the honest accounting of the barn and everything else she was learning about who he was. She was building a picture. She didn't know yet what it would look like when it was finished. The hardest part of those weeks wasn't the money or the hours, or even Kent's deadline hanging over everything. The hardest part was Daniel. He'd been doing well better than she could have hoped, in some ways. The work with Wyatt had given him something to put himself into, some channel for all that 14-year-old intensity that had been turning inward since his father died. He was good with his hands, better than she'd known, and Wyatt had recognized it and given him real work, rather than child-appropriate tasks, which Daniel had absorbed like water into dry ground. There was something underneath. She could see it, but she couldn't reach it. She found him sitting alone behind the barn one evening, not long after Kent's visit. He had a piece of wood in his hands, and he was just holding it, not carving or working it, just holding it and staring at nothing. He'd done this before. James used to do this too. The same posture, the same quality of stillness, and the familiarity of it hit her in the chest every time. She sat down beside him, not asking anything, just sitting. After a while he said, Kent's going to take the land, isn't he? Not if I can help it. but you might not be able to help it. She didn't lie to him. He was 14 and he'd seen enough of the truth to know when he was being managed. It's possible, she said. That's why we're working so hard. He turned the piece of wood over. What happens to us if he does? We figure out something else. We don't stop. Where would we go? She didn't have a perfect answer for that, and she didn't pretend she did. I don't know yet. But there is somewhere. There's always somewhere. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Is Cole going to stay if things go bad? She hadn't expected that question. I don't know, she said honestly. I hope so. But you don't know, he nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer and was making peace with it. I don't want to count on him, and then have him go, he said, very quietly, like it cost something to say. She understood exactly what he meant. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly. He was at the age where physical comfort was complicated, where sometimes he wanted it, and sometimes it made him feel young in a way he resisted, and she felt him not pull away. That's fair, she said. You don't have to count on him. You don't have to decide anything about him. Just let things be what they are right now. He thought about it. He showed me how to read a load-bearing joint, he said. Yesterday. He said most men guess at it, and that's why buildings fall down. That sounds like him. He's patient about it. The teaching. He paused. Dad wasn't. Not about building stuff. He'd get frustrated if you didn't get it fast. She felt the particular complexity of hearing her dead husband compared and not coming out ahead. She didn't defend James, and she didn't agree with Daniel. She just said, different people teach different ways. Yeah. He stood up, tucked the piece of wood in his pocket. I'm going to go help with dinner. He went inside. She sat there for a moment longer in the cold, behind the barn that was becoming more solid every day, and she thought about all the things she was building simultaneously, the physical structures, the financial scramble, the fragile and intricate thing happening between her boys and this man and his daughter, and she thought about how any one of them could still fall. She went inside and made dinner. 2 weeks before the deadline, the accident happened. She had been working since 4 a.m. The preserve batches required constant attention. The timing on the seals had to be exact, or you lost the whole jar, and she'd lost 3 already this week to rushing, and those 3 jars represented money she didn't have. She was exhausted, in the bone-deep way that had stopped feeling dramatic, and just felt like the weather, like something you moved through rather than felt. The kitchen was hot from the stove, and her hands were wet, and she'd been on her feet for 9 hours. She was lifting a full canning pot heavy, steam rising from it, the kind of weight that required both hands and full attention when her left hand slipped. It happened fast, and also somehow slowly, the way bad moments often did. Pot tilted. She grabbed for it with her right hand. The boiling water came over the rim and hit her hands, and she got the pot back on the stove, but the damp was done. She didn't scream. She made a sound something short and involuntary, and then she ran cold water over her hands at the basin and stood there shaking and doing the mental assessment of what this meant before she'd finished processing the pain. Her right hand was worse than her left. The palm, mostly. She could still make a fist, but it was going to blister, and the next 2 weeks were supposed to be the heaviest production, weeks before the deadline. Daniel was at the table. He'd been labeling jars. He'd seen it happen, and he was already beside her. Let me see, he said. I'm fine, Mama. He said it with a weight that was too old for 14. Let me see. She showed him her hands. He looked at them without flinching. He'd gotten better at that, at looking at hard things straight on, and then he went and got the salve from the shelf, and the strips of clean cloth she kept for exactly these occasions, because life on a homestead was a series of small injuries, and you planned for them. He wrapped her hands with more care than she expected. His big hands, James's hands, same shape, were careful around hers. I can do the pouring, he said, and the lifting. You can do the timing and the seals. I know what to do. I've been watching. It's not I know how, he said. I've been watching you do it for 2 weeks. I know the timing, and I know the water temperature, and I know how to test the seals. He looked at her directly. Let me. She looked at her son, this boy who'd been trying to be a man since October, who'd been carrying a weight too big for him and carrying it without complaint, who'd learned to hold boards steady on a ladder in below-zero cold and read load-bearing joints and accept that crying didn't change anything. This boy who still had his father's jaw and his father's hands and something else that was entirely his own, something more patient than James, something more willing to wait. Okay, she said. He was good at it. He was genuinely, honestly good at it, not just adequate but good, with the natural competence of someone who had inherited a practical intelligence and had been paying close attention. He kept the batches moving. He asked her questions most when he wasn't sure and deferred to her judgment, on timing, without ego. He worked until 10 o'clock that night, and then she sent him to bed, and she sat at the table and looked at the rows of finished jars and felt something she couldn't quite name pride, yes, but also something else. Something like watching the future take a shape you hadn't anticipated, but found you could live with. Wyatt came in the next morning and saw her hands. She watched him clock it. His face didn't change much, but his eyes moved fast over the wrappings, and something tightened briefly in his jaw, and then released. How bad, he said. Manageable. Did you sleep? Enough. He looked at the jars. Daniel did this? Most of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that kid is going to be something. He already is something. Yeah. He looked at the jars again. Yeah, he is. It was Wyatt who solved the money problem, and he did it in a way that didn't violate what she'd said at the table. He didn't offer her money. What he did was go to every person in a 20-mile radius who owed him a favor or a debt and call them all in at once. Not in cash, but in kind, a rancher named Pollard, who owed him for a winter rescue, 3 years back, agreed to purchase 40 jars of preserves at full price up front. A widow named Gertrude Hess, who'd had Wyatt repair her fence the previous fall, bought 20 jars and told 3 of her friends, who sent their own orders in within the week. The dry goods man, Aro, who had been quietly watching all of this from his store, extended Sarah's credit without being asked, and added a note, pay when you can. I know you will. She hadn't cried in months. She did not cry when she read Aro's note, but she had to sit down for a moment. The numbers were still tight, but they were different than they'd been. It was Marcus who told her about Kent's men going to see Daniel. Came in on a Saturday afternoon, breathless from running, and the look on his face was the look of a child who had information he didn't know what to do with. He'd been in town. Wyatt had taken him along to pick up supplies, and he'd seen 2 of Kent's hired men stop Daniel on the main street. Daniel had been at the hardware store for bolts. The men hadn't touched him, but they'd talked to him. Marcus had been too far away to hear everything, but he'd seen Daniel's face during it. He went white, Marcus said. Like really white. And then he walked away, and I don't think he saw me. Sarah looked at Wyatt. Wyatt's expression had gone very still. Where's Daniel now? Coming back. He was behind me, but I ran. They waited. Daniel came in 8 minutes later. He walked in and looked at his mother, and she could see he'd been deciding what to say and had landed on the truth. 2 of Kent's men talked to me, he said, on the street. What did they say? He was quiet for a moment. They said to tell you that Mr. Kent is a patient man, but that patience has a limit. They said he stopped. His jaw worked. They said that a family without a man to protect it was vulnerable to all kinds of misfortune. And I should think about that. The room was very quiet. Marcus had gone pale. Samuel had come in from the back room at some point and was standing in the doorway, watching. Wyatt said quietly and without inflection, they threatened you. They were careful about it, Daniel said. They were careful not to say anything I could quote directly. But yeah, Sarah felt something cold move through her that was not fear exactly, or it was fear but a very specific kind, the kind that came with absolute clarity. The kind that burned off everything extra and left you with just the essential question, what do you do now? What you did not do, she decided in that moment, was break. She looked at Daniel. Are you all right? I'm angry, he said. Good. Stay angry. It's more useful than scared. I'm that too. That's fine also. Wyatt stood up from where he'd been sitting. He went to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at nothing. She could see the twins were dark. She could see the muscle in his jaw, the same tell she'd catalogued, weeks ago, the place where his temper lived under the surface. Wyatt, she said. He turned. I know what you're thinking, she said. Don't. His eyes were hard. He sent men to threaten a 14-year-old boy. I know. I know what it is. She kept her voice steady. But you going to Kent's ranch and doing whatever is in your head right now doesn't help my boys. Gives Kent something to use. You end up in a fight or worse, and then I'm really alone. She held his gaze. That's not what I need from you, a long moment. The muscle in his jaw worked. He breathed out slowly, like he was releasing something that cost him to release. Then what do you need? he said. "I need us to finish what we started. I need us to make enough money to pay that note and shove it back in his face legally, properly, in a way he can't argue with. That's the only thing that actually beats him." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. Short, tight. "All right," she said. Daniel was watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone learning a language. She could see him taking it apart the way she'd spoken, the way Wyatt had listened, the way they'd resolved something, without anyone needing to perform. That night, after everyone else was in bed, she heard Wyatt moving quietly in the kitchen. She came downstairs to find him sitting at the table with the financial papers spread out in front of him, not working on them, just looking at them. There was something in his posture that she recognized because she'd had it herself many times. The posture of a person who cannot sleep and is doing the closest thing to control that's available at 2 in the morning, which is to simply look at the problem. She sat down across from him. "I keep thinking about the men who talked to Daniel," he said without looking up. "Me too. I keep thinking about what I want to do about it." "And what do you want to do?" He looked up. His face in the low lamplight was tired and honest, and not particularly comfortable to look at the face of a man in conflict with himself, which was not a performed conflict but a real one. "Something I shouldn't," he said. "Something that would feel good for about 10 minutes and then create problems I can't fix." "So you're not going to do it?" "No, I'm not going to do it." He said it like a decision he'd just finished making. "But I want you to know I'm not fine with it. I'm not sitting here feeling calm and reasonable. I'm sitting here working at it." She looked at him across the table, at the papers, at his hands on the papers, at his face. "I know," she said. "I see that." He looked at her. "Does it bother you? That I'm not just steady about it?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It would bother me more if you were." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but something. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have a lot of work tomorrow." "You too." She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and thought about 5 weeks ago, when this man had been a shape in the road she barely knew. She thought about all the things that had been built in that time, the barn wall, the jar count, strange and careful architecture of trust between her boys and this man and his daughter, and she thought about the note and the deadline, and Kent's men on the street, and the fact that they were still short on the full amount, and she was already exhausted, and her hands hurt, and she thought, "We are still here. Every day we are still here is a day he hasn't won." The preserve orders kept coming in. Word was traveling in the invisible way that word traveled in rural Montana, not through newspapers or announcements, but through women talking to women at dry goods stores and post offices, through the kind of networks that men like Kent never fully understood because they'd never needed to pay attention to them. A hotel in the next county sent a letter asking for a standing monthly order. 2 of the women who had previously crossed the street to avoid Sarah Mitchell sent tentative notes asking if she had jars available. She wrote back to all of them. Yes, she had jars available. She had more jars than she'd thought possible 4 weeks ago because she had a 14-year-old son with his father's hands and more patience than his father, and a man who'd called in every favor he had. The Zvitz windows were dark, and a Finnish dry goods man who'd extended credit without being asked, and an 8-year-old girl who'd become her youngest son's reason to talk again. She had all of that, and it was not nothing. It was, in fact, the most she'd had in a long time. The day before the deadline, she counted everything. She sat at the table in the early morning while the house was still quiet, and she counted and added and recounted, the way she'd done every night for weeks, except this time the number at the bottom of the column was different. Close? She was closer than she had any rational right to be. She was still short, not by $400 anymore, by less than $100, but still short and still one day away, and there was a limit to what could change in a day. She sat with that for a moment, the weight of it, the nearness of not quite enough, which was in some ways harder than being far away, because far away you didn't have to look at the gap so closely. She was still sitting there when the knock came at the door. It was early, barely past 6, and she couldn't imagine who was knocking at that hour. She opened the door and found Gertrude Hess on her porch. Gertrude was past 70, had been ranching alone in this valley since her husband died 20 years back, and had the particular quality of some old women who have survived everything and decided to stop being careful about what they said. "I heard about the note," Gertrude said, without greeting or preamble, and I heard the number. She held out an envelope. I've got money I'm not using, and I'm not lending it to you. I'm investing. Your preserves are the best thing coming out of this valley, and anyone who doesn't see that is a fool. I want 20% of whatever you sell for the next year. You can argue with me, or you can take it. Sarah stared at the envelope. Take it, Gertrude said. She took it. Inside was exactly what she needed. Not a penny more or less, which meant Gertrude had known the number precisely, which meant the information network of women in this valley was more sophisticated than Sarah had fully appreciated. Stood on the porch with the envelope and felt the specific physical sensation of something that has been held very tight for a very long time beginning to release. Not releasing fully, just beginning. Wyatt appeared from the barn, where he'd apparently been up early too. He saw her face. What happened? He said. She held up the envelope. He looked at it. Enough, she said. He didn't whoop or throw his hat. He stood there and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully name relief. Yes, but also something that had been building for weeks. Something that had to do with two people who'd each been alone for too long and had somehow, in the emergency of survival, built something neither of them had intended to build, and neither was quite ready to name. Then let's go pay it, he said. They went to Kent's office that afternoon. All of them, Sarah, Wyatt, and Daniel, who had asked to come and whom Sarah had not felt able to refuse. They walked in, and Sarah put the money on Kent's desk, the full amount, and she put it there without apology or performance. Just set it down and said, "The note, please." Kent looked at the money for a long time. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Sarah. She watched something move across his face, not gracious defeat, because a man like Kent didn't do gracious defeat. It was something more private, something that had to do with looking at a woman he'd underestimated and being forced to revise his assessment in front of witnesses. He counted the money. He checked the count twice. He pulled the note from his desk drawer, and he held it for a moment, just a moment before he put it on the desk between them. "We're square," he said. Sarah picked up the note. "Yes," she said. "We are." She walked out of Kent's office into the cold afternoon, the note in her hand, and she kept her face absolutely still all the way down the street and around the corner, and then she stopped walking and put her back against the wall of the nearest building and breathed. Wyatt and Daniel stopped with her. Daniel was looking at her with wide eyes. He'd never seen her at the edge of composure before, had always seen the composed version, and she could see him adjusting his understanding of her in real time. "Mama," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I just need 1 minute." She took the minute. Then she stood up straight. "Let's go home," she said. They went home. The note sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Sarah put it away. She didn't frame it or make a ceremony of it. She just kept finding reasons to leave it there, coming downstairs in the morning and seeing it and feeling something settle in her chest, the way you pressed a bruise sometimes, not because it felt good, but because you needed to confirm it was real. On the 3rd day, she folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept important papers, next to James's death certificate and the boys' birth records, and she closed the lid and put the box back on the high shelf. Except it wasn't, of course. Paying the note had solved one problem and clarified several others. The preserve business was real now, not a scramble, not a desperate measure, but an actual ongoing concern with actual ongoing customers, and it needed organization she hadn't had time to build while she was fighting for her life. Gertrude Hess came by on the 4th day and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a brisk no-nonsense manner and said, "Now, let's talk about how this actually works." Gertrude had run her own cattle operation for 20 years alone. She knew accounts receivable, and she knew supply chains, and she knew, with the particular authority of someone who had learned everything the hard way, exactly which corners could be cut and which ones would catch up with you later. She and Sarah sat at that table for 2 hours and built something that looked less like a survival strategy and more like an actual business, with actual records and actual pricing and a plan for scaling that didn't depend on Sarah working until her hands gave out. "You need help," Gertrude said. "Not just Cole. Another woman. Someone who can work the batches when you need to do other things. Can't pay a wage yet. Clara Hofstede has been asking around about you." Gertrude said it without the particular expression, like it was simply information. "I think she feels bad about the winter." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Clara, who had crossed the street. Clara, who had not said good morning. She should feel bad, Sarah said. Yes, Gertrude said. She does. The question is whether you want to let that be useful or whether you'd rather be right. It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her in months. She appreciated it precisely because it didn't pretend the situation wasn't complicated. Let me think about it, Sarah said. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it while she worked, while she managed the boys' schooling. She'd been doing it herself since the town school had quietly stopped, including her sons on the attendance rolls. Another wound she decided to deal with later, and while she lay awake at night doing the particular arithmetic of pride versus practicality that she'd become expert at over the winter. She sent word to Clara Hofstede on a Wednesday. Clara arrived on Thursday. She was a thin woman in her late 40s with the face of someone who worked outdoors and the look of a person who had prepared several versions of an apology and wasn't sure which one to use. She stood in Sarah's doorway holding a jar of her own, preserves an almost painful gesture, Sarah thought, but also kind in its way, bringing preserves to a woman who made preserves. I'm not going to give you a speech, Clara said. I was wrong. I was afraid of what people would think it doesn't matter. I was wrong. Sarah looked at her for a moment. You can put those down, she said. Then I'll show you how we do the batches. That was as much forgiveness as she had available right then. Clara seemed to understand it was more than she'd earned and accepted it accordingly. The dynamic inside the cabin and around the property had shifted in the weeks since the note was paid, shifted in ways that were mostly good and occasionally complicated, which was about the ratio you could reasonably hope for. Wyatt was still there every day, still working with Daniel on the construction jobs that were bringing in steady income, still eating dinner with them 3 or 4 nights a week, still occupying the particular space he'd carved out over months that was neither family exactly, nor outside something in between, something that didn't have a clean word. Emma was essentially living there during the days. She'd been given her own hook by the door for her coat, which had happened organically. She kept leaving it on the same peg, and eventually Sarah had simply assigned it to her, and Samuel had started saving the seat beside him at the table without being asked. One night in March, after dinner, Marcus looked around the table and said with the uncurated directness of an 11-year-old, "Are you going to just keep eating dinner here forever? Or are you going to be our family?" The question landed in the middle of the table like something dropped. Emma looked at her father. Wyatt looked at his plate for a moment, then at Sarah. Daniel was looking at his food with an expression that suggested he was deeply interested in its texture. Samuel was watching Marcus with the careful attention of someone who had wanted to ask the same question and had not known how. Sarah said calmly, "Marcus, that's not a dinner conversation." "Why not?" "Because it's not." "But Marcus," she said it with enough weight that he stopped. But she could feel Wyatt not looking at her from across the table, and she could feel her own face doing something complicated, and she was grateful the lamp was low. After the boys were in bed, she found Wyatt on the porch. He was leaning against the post, not quite looking at anything, and he had his arms crossed the way he did when he was working through something he hadn't finished working through yet. She stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry about Marcus," she said. "Don't be." His voice was quiet. He asked a real question. She didn't say anything. "You don't have to answer it," he said. "Not now." I'm not putting pressure on you. I want to be clear about that. Whatever this is, I'm not going anywhere." He paused, but he asked a real question. She looked at the side of his face. The profile she'd learned over these months, the way the set of it changed when he was worried, versus tired, versus angry, versus that particular quality of careful that he used when he was trying to say something true. "I know he did," she said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a little longer, and then he went home. She lay awake for a long time, not thinking about Wyatt exactly, or not only about Wyatt but about James, about the shape his absence had taken in her life, about the difference between the acute pain of early grief and this newer thing, which was more like learning to walk differently after an injury, learning what you could and couldn't put weight on. She thought about whether caring about someone new was a betrayal or whether it was just living, whether it was possible to honor the dead without making their absence into a wall. She didn't arrive at any conclusions, but she slept better than she expected. Warren Kent's reversal, when it came, was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. She'd expected drama, had expected him to find some other lever to pull, some new way to make her life difficult, And instead what happened was nothing. A week passed, then two. No men on the road. No Aldrich with papers. Just silence from the Kent ranch, which was either a good sign or the kind of quiet that preceded something worse, and she spent too many mornings trying to decide which. It was Gertrude, again, who provided information. Gertrude seemed to know everything in the valley by some mechanism Sarah had never fully mapped. "He's been sick," Gertrude said, coming by on a Thursday in late March. "Something with his chest. He's been in bed for 2 weeks. His foreman's running the ranch." "Serious?" Sarah asked. "Serious enough that he's letting other people run things, which isn't like him." She sat with that. She tried to feel satisfied about it and mostly couldn't, which surprised her. She'd spent months being afraid of and furious at Warren Kent, and now that he was sick and absent, what she mostly felt was a low-grade unease that she couldn't quite explain. She mentioned it to Wyatt that evening. "Does it bother you?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "I don't know what to do with it," she said. "I spent 4 months fighting this man. I paid his note. I thought when that was done I'd feel finished with him. Somehow. But it doesn't feel finished. Because it's not," Wyatt said. "He still lives 20 miles away. This is still a small valley. Finished doesn't really happen with neighbors. So what does happen?" He thought about it. "You find a way to live in the same place with people you have history with. Sometimes that history changes. Sometimes it doesn't. But you don't get to be done with it the way you can be done with a note." She looked at him. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "Some." He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. There were things about Wyatt's life before Montana that she still didn't know, things she sensed existed, not because he was hiding them, but because he hadn't found the way to say them yet. And she understood that because she had the same relationship to certain things in her own past. People who'd been through hard things developed a kind of interior filing system, what you could access easily, what required more handling, what lived in the back, where you didn't go often. She was familiar with her own system. She was learning slowly the shape of his. Spring thaw came in early April, which in Montana meant not that winter was over, but that winter was having second thoughts. Temperatures swung wildly. Mud made everything twice as hard, and the particular misery of mud season replaced the particular misery of snow season with no pleasant interval between them. The barn held. All that work through the cold months proved itself now. The new east wall didn't shift. The roof didn't leak. Where Wyatt and Daniel had worked on it, the doors hung true. Daniel noticed this. He mentioned it. To Wyatt, in passing, the doors are still good in the tone of someone marking that something they'd worked on had passed a test. Wyatt said, "You hung them." Daniel said, "You showed me how. That's not the same as me doing it. You did it." She was nearby, and she heard this, and she thought about the conversations that didn't happen in words, the long, slow negotiation between a boy who'd lost his father and a man who'd lost his wife, the careful thing being built between them that neither of them talked about directly, because talking about it directly would have required naming it, and they weren't ready for the name. It was around this time that Reverend Clayton came to the cabin. She saw him coming up the road, and her first instinct was the same as when Kent had come, the instinct to position herself, to prepare, to decide in advance what she would and wouldn't accept. But Clayton walked differently than Kent had. Kent had come like a man enforcing something. Clayton came like a man who wasn't sure he deserved to be there. He knocked. She opened the door. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said. He had his hat in his hands, literally hat in hands, which she'd never seen on him before. He was a man who wore authority like a coat, and he had taken the coat off. "Reverend, I was hoping to talk with you. If you have a few minutes. If that's acceptable." She stood back from the door. "Come in." He sat at the kitchen table. She poured coffee because that was what you did, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment before looking at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've owed it for a while. I've been finding reasons not to deliver it, that's a failure of character I'm aware of." He paused. "What I said to you on the road in January, what I implied about your situation, about what you represented, it was wrong, not misguided. Wrong." She listened. "I was more concerned with the opinions of certain members of my congregation than with what was actually true or what was actually right. And one of those members," he stopped. "Warren Kent has been a significant donor to the church for many years. I'm not telling you that as an excuse. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the full picture. She looked at him steadily. Kent pressured you, he suggested. He didn't need to do much more than suggest. I did the rest myself. He looked up from the coffee cup. Your boys are without a proper school. I know you've been teaching them yourself. The school board, I have some influence there, and I've been using it badly. That can change if you want it to. She was quiet for a moment. What changed? She asked. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I watched you pay that note, he said. I was in town that day. I saw you walk in and walk out. He paused, and I thought about what it took to do that, what you'd done to get to that point. And I thought about what I'd been doing while you were doing it. He set the cup down. I was ashamed. I am ashamed. I don't know if that does you any good. She thought about Gertrude's question, whether you'd rather be right or whether you'd rather be useful. School, she said. My boys are behind now, the older two especially. I'll see to it, not just that they're allowed back, that they're not treated. I understand. I'll see to it personally. She looked at him for another long moment. All right, she said. He left. She sat at the table after he was gone and drank the rest of her coffee and thought about the strange cumulative weight of this, the apologies arriving now, late and imperfect, from people who had failed her at the worst time. She didn't feel triumphant. She mostly felt tired and a little sad and slightly tender, in the way a healing wound was tender when you pressed it. Still hurt, but it was different than the original wound. Wyatt took the news about Clayton with a grunt that contained multitudes. Their lady said, Yes, the school's a good thing for the boys. I know. She looked at him. You don't think Clayton deserves credit. I think he deserves exactly as much credit as someone gets for stopping doing something wrong, he said, which is some. Not a lot. That seems fair. I'm a fair man, he said, and the corner of Mao's mouth did the thing it occasionally did that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Spring proper arrived in mid-April, and with it came the storm season, which in that part of Montana was not a metaphor, but a genuine annual reckoning. The valley was prone to violent weather thunderstorms that came fast, heavy rains that flooded the lower creek land, and in bad years the kind of tornado weather that the older ranchers discussed with a specific gravity, the kind of respect you gave to things that had shown you what they could do. The morning of the 23rd of April had that quality, the particular feeling in the air that Sarah had learned to read over years of Montana springs. Too warm for the season, too still, the sky a color that wasn't quite right. She'd grown up hearing her father describe the sky before bad weather, and she felt it in her bones in a way that wasn't mystical, but just accumulated experience. Wyatt felt it too. He arrived early that morning and looked at the sky and didn't say anything for a moment. Today, she said? Maybe, he said. Possibly tonight. Hard to know. They spent the morning securing what could be secured. The livestock moved to the lower section of the barn, the equipment covered, the loose lumber stacked and weighted. But much. The boys helped without being asked much. Even Samuel carried what he could, working alongside Emma with the focused seriousness of children who had learned that adults moved differently when something was coming. By midday, the sky had gone that particular green-gray that meant the question was no longer if but when. Tornado came at 4 in the afternoon. It didn't hit the Mitchell property directly. It cut a path about a quarter-mile south, through the lower valley, and from the barn door, Sarah could see it, could see the shape of it, that terrible orderly violence of a column of air doing what air did when conditions were exactly wrong. She had all 5 children, her 3 boys and Emma, and also one of the Galbraith children who'd been there helping Daniel with a project in the barn. And she stood at the door watching and counting seconds. The roar of it was something you didn't experience from a distance. You felt it in your chest, in your back teeth, in some part of your physical body that was below conscious awareness and responded to the sound with pure ancient animal fear. Wyatt was beside her. Kent's ranch is in the path, he said. She looked where he was looking. The tornado was moving northeast, and the Kent ranch sat at the edge of the lower valley. She could see the outbuildings from here. On a clear day, couldn't see them now through the wall of wind and debris, but she knew where they were. His workers, she said. Yeah, they looked at each other. She would think about that look later, what passed between them in those 3 seconds without words. It was not a simple look. It was not uncomplicated. It contained the full history of Warren Kent, what he'd done, what he'd tried to do, the men he'd sent to threaten her 14-year-old son, the proposal that had been an insult dressed as a compliment, the months of pressure and fear. All of that was in the look. And then they both turned toward the horses. "Daniel," she said, raising her voice over the wind, "you're in charge. Keep everyone in the barn. Do not open these doors until I come back." Daniel looked at her, looked at Wyatt. "I'm coming." "No. There are people, and I need you here with the little ones." She met his eyes and she held them. "I need to know they're safe, and I need to know it's you. Can you do that?" A pause. She could see him fighting it, the part of him that wanted to go, that had been building toward going for months, the part that was increasingly not a child and knew it. "Yes," he said. "Good." She touched his face quickly. "Good." She and Wyatt rode out into the storm. Quarter-mile between the Mitchell property and the Kent ranch took longer than it should have, because the wind was wrong, and the horses were terrified, and the debris in the air required constant attention branches. Something that had been a fence rail, unidentifiable things, moving fast in directions that required ducking and adjusting. She had her face down, and she was riding mostly by instinct and by following Wyatt's horse ahead of her. The tornado had moved past the main Kent property by the time they arrived, but it had left specific devastation. The eastern equipment barn was gone, simply gone, boards spread across 100 yards of ground. The foreman's quarters had lost its roof. The main house was standing, but one wall had been caved in by something large, and there were people outside, workers, ranch hands, some of them moving, some of them not. She didn't think about Kent or the note or the winter. She got off the horse and she went to the nearest person who needed help, and she helped. It was 3 hours. 3 hours of carrying and directing and improvising with whatever materials were available, organizing the ranch hands who were functional into helping the ones who weren't, of making decisions quickly about what needed to happen in what order. Most of its windows were structural problem, assessing which parts of the building were safe to enter and which weren't, pulling 2 men out of the foreman's quarters before a secondary collapse, doing it with a competence and calm that Sarah filed away without comment, because there wasn't time for comment. Warren Kent was found in the main house. He wasn't badly hurt, some lacerations, a sprained wrist from where he'd apparently been thrown against a wall, but he was shaken in a way she hadn't seen on him before. The unshakable quality was gone. He was sitting on the floor of his study, which had kept its ceiling, surrounded by papers that the wind had scattered everywhere, and he looked up when she came in, and his face did something she hadn't expected. He looked relieved. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "can you walk?" He looked at his legs like he was checking. "Yes." "Then let's get you outside. The house isn't safe yet." She helped him up. He was heavier than she expected, and he leaned on her more than was comfortable, but she kept walking, and he kept moving, and they got out. He sat on the ground outside, and she checked his lacerations, not severe, nothing that needed more than cleaning. And he watched her do it with an expression that was not his usual expression at all. Not authority or calculation. Something much more basic. "You came," he said. "Your workers needed help. You didn't have to." She didn't say anything to that. She finished checking his arm and stood up. "I had men follow your boy," he said quietly. "That was, I want you to know, that wasn't a thing I'm proud of." She looked at him. "No," she said, "it wasn't." He held her gaze. He was a man who had spent decades not being held to account for things, and it showed. The discomfort of it was visible. But he held the gaze. "I'll make it right," he said. "With Daniel. With you. I'll make it right." She didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't, and he didn't deserve the comfort of hearing it was. But she also didn't hold on to the anger the way she might have 2 months ago. She was tired of holding things. Some things you put down not because they didn't matter, but because carrying them was costing you more than they were worth. "We'll see," she said, and then she went back to work. Wyatt found her an hour later, after the immediate crisis had been managed, after the ranch hands who needed it had been attended to, after the structural assessment was done. He found her sitting on a fence rail that had somehow remained standing, just sitting, the adrenaline draining out of her in a way that left her limbs heavy. He sat beside her on the rail. They looked at what the storm had done. "Kent talked to me," he said. "About what?" "About Daniel. About everything." He paused. He offered to fund the school. Full school, proper teacher, proper building. Not charity, he said. A condition of it, and he actually said this, is that Daniel gets first position as assistant when he's old enough. She turned to look at him. Daniel doesn't need Kent's. I know, Wyatt said, but the town does. And the school does. And I think Kent knows this is the only way back from what he did that means anything. He looked at her. It's your call. All of it. Always your call. She turned back to the wreckage of the Kent ranch. She thought about what it meant to let someone repair something they'd broken. Whether you could accept the repair without erasing the break. Whether those two things could exist at the same time. Could. She knew they could. She'd been doing it since January, holding the hurt and the hopes simultaneously, which was not comfortable, but was the only honest way through. Tell him yes, she said, about the school. Wyatt nodded. They rode back to the Mitchell property. In the long, late afternoon light, the storm moved east now, the sky behind them still dark, and the sky ahead beginning to clear into that specific clean color that came after violence too bright, almost fragile, the world washed and raw. She could see the barn from the road. It was standing. The cabin was standing. And in the doorway, outlined against the lamplight, someone had already lit inside. She could see Daniel tall, shoulders square, standing in the door, the way she'd asked him to stand while she was gone. He'd held it. He saw them coming, and he raised one hand, not a wave exactly. Just an acknowledgement. Just, I see you. You're back. It's okay. And then he turned and went inside. She felt Wyatt looking at her from his horse. She didn't look back, but she felt it. Your boy's going to be all right, he said. I know, she said. All of them are. She believed it when she said it. That was the thing, she actually believed it. Not as a wish or a performance of confidence or something she was saying to hold herself together. She believed it the way you believed something you'd earned the right to believe. Through the specific hard curriculum of the past months, through everything that had been taken and everything that had been built in the space the taking left. She rode the rest of the way home in the quiet. Inside, Marcus had made coffee badly, too strong, but made. Emma was sitting with Samuel on the floor, and they were looking at his drawing again, the one with the figures in front of the house, the family that had gotten larger. And Samuel was pointing to things and talking. Actually talking, a running quiet explanation of the people in the drawing, and Emma was listening with the complete attention she always gave him. Sarah stood in the doorway and listened for a moment without announcing herself. Samuel was pointing to the two figures he'd added at the edge of the paper. That's Emma, he said, and that's Wyatt. He said the names without qualification or uncertainty. Not that might be, or I think that could be. Just that's Emma. That's Wyatt. Facts. Emma looked at the drawing and then at Samuel. Where do we live in the picture? Samuel considered this seriously. He pointed to the house. Here, same house. Emma nodded, like this was a reasonable and complete answer. Sarah stepped back from the doorway before they saw her. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with the sounds of the house around her. Marcus clattering with the coffee pot. Daniel coming down the stairs. Wyatt's boots on the porch. She had not expected this. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had not expected any of this particular version of her life. She'd expected to survive because she'd decided she would survive. But this is specific, messy, difficult, full thing, school and the note and the barn, Daniel on the roof and Samuel talking, and Emma's coat on the peg and Wyatt at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. looking at hard numbers. None of this had been the shape she'd imagined. It was better and harder than imagined. Real things usually were. The door opened and Wyatt came in, bringing cold air with him and the smell of horses and storm aftermath and honest work. He looked at her standing in the kitchen. He didn't say anything for a moment. The Galbraith boy got home safe, he said. I sent word. Thank you. He nodded. He moved to hang up his coat, and she watched him do it. Watched him move through her kitchen with the ease of someone who had learned the space, who knew which floorboard creaked and which cabinet stuck and where she kept the extra lamp oil, all the 1,000 small pieces of that accumulated when you were somewhere regularly when you stayed. Wyatt, she said. He turned. She looked at him. She thought about everything she might say, and she picked the truest version. I'm glad you were here today. He held her gaze. I'm glad I was here too, he said. Not as a line. Not as a moment. Just as a fact stated plainly, the way he stated most things. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the sky had finished clearing. Through the window, she could see the first stars coming, up the valley, dark and quiet now, the storm truly gone. The air, that specific cold clean of aftermath. Everything still standing that was supposed to be standing. everyone accounted for. She put the kettle on. The water took time to boil, the way it always did, the way everything took the time it took, and not less, and she stood at the stove and waited, and the house breathed around her footsteps, voices, the small sounds of people occupying space, the sounds of a home that was being lived in, and she waited, and the water came to heat, and she poured it, and the night settled in around all of them. The morning after the storm, Mercy looked like a place that had been turned inside out and put back together by someone working from memory. Trees down across the lower road. Fencing scattered in patterns that made no sense until you traced the wind's path through the valley, and then it made a terrible kind of logic. The Galbraith family had lost their equipment shed, entirely four walls and a roof, simply gone, the foundation sitting bare and confused in the April mud. Two other families along the creek had damage ranging from serious to catastrophic, and the general mood in the valley that morning was the specific, exhausted solidarity that came after shared disaster, when people who had been maintaining careful distances from each other found themselves standing in the same wreckage, and the distances seemed suddenly less important. Sarah had been up since 5, not because of the storm damage her property had come through better than most, the work of the past months, proving itself in the way that only weather and time could prove structural work, but because her mind wouldn't stop moving. She'd lain there, in the gray pre-dawn, sorting through everything that had happened in the previous afternoon. Kent's face when she'd helped him off the floor, the ranch hands working alongside Wyatt, without knowing anything about the history between their employer and these two people who'd ridden in from the storm. Daniel standing in the doorway with his hand raised. Samuel's voice describing the drawing. She got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen's window and watched the valley come back to itself in the early light. Wyatt arrived before 7 with Emma and with Pollard, the rancher who'd bought the first large preserve order months ago, and behind Pollard came 2 of the Galbraith boys, and behind them, which she had not expected, came Clara Hofstede with her husband and their oldest son. They came up the road in a loose convoy, and they came with tools, stood on the porch and watched them come. Wyatt looked up at her from the road. "Valley's got damage," he said. "I figured we'd work our way through it. Start with the Galbraiths, then the Hendersons down on the creek. Your place is okay. I checked the barn before I came over." "You checked my barn before I was awake?" "You were awake." She looked at him. "You couldn't have known that." "You're always awake," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing. She went inside and got her coat. What happened over the next 3 days was not a transformation, because real things didn't transform, they accumulated. But it was something. People showed up who hadn't spoken to each other in years. Disagreements about fence lines that had been simmering for a decade got set aside because there was work to do, and the work required being in the same space. And when you were in the same space long enough doing hard physical labor, the fence line disagreement started to look what it actually was, which was 2 people being stubborn, something that mattered less than they decided it did. Sarah worked alongside Clara Hofstede for most of the second day, rebuilding the Galbraith equipment shed walls. They didn't have a long, emotional conversation. They didn't excavate the winter and examine it together. They worked, and when Clara made a mistake measuring a board and swore under her breath and then glanced at Sarah like she expected judgment, Sarah said, "I did that exact thing last week." Cut it again, and they moved on. That was as much as needed to happen between them, and it was enough. School question resolved itself faster than Sarah had anticipated, and in a way she hadn't quite predicted. Reverend Clayton had made good on his word about the school board. Her boys were back on the rolls within the week after his visit, and Daniel and Marcus had returned to the schoolhouse with the particular combination of relief and wariness of children who had been excluded and weren't sure what re-inclusion would feel like. It felt, as it turned out, mostly like school, boring in the familiar ways, and occasionally interesting and full of the specific social complexity of children who had to negotiate with each other daily and didn't yet have the adult tools to make it smooth. Samuel, who was young enough that the exclusion had been less visible to him, went back with the straightforward happiness of a 7-year-old who wanted to be around other children. He was talking now fully, regularly, with the slightly too much quality of someone who had been silent for too long and was making up for lost time. His teacher sent Sarah a note. At the end of the first week, Samuel is a remarkable child. He had a lot to say about barn construction and preserve making and weather patterns. He is also very knowledgeable about dogs, though he doesn't appear to own one. Sarah read this twice and smiled and put it in the tin box with the important papers. Warren Kent's involvement with the school became real and then complicated and then real again, which was about how most things involving Warren Kent seemed to go. He had pledged the funding in the aftermath of the storm with the sincerity of a man who had been genuinely shaken and had meant every word. Then he had gone back to his ranch and started feeling better, and started also feeling the friction of what it meant to actually follow through on a promise that required ongoing humility, which was not his natural condition. He came to see Sarah in early May. He looked better than he had on the ground after the tornado. The authority was back, in his posture, the deliberateness in his movements, but something had changed in his face, some quality around the eyes that hadn't been there before. Like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. The school funding, he said, sitting at our kitchen table, where many important conversations had happened, I want to do it properly. Not just money. I want to. I've been thinking about what it should look like. Proper building. A teacher who's paid a real wage. Enough books that children don't have to share. She listened. I also want to be direct with you about something, he said. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. She'd noticed that people did this at her table, as if the cup was a thing to hold on to. I've been talking to Aldrich, and to some of the people at the church. He paused. I've been the reason that certain things in this town have gone the way they went. Not just with you, with other people. Families who needed something and were told no because of what I said or didn't say. He looked at her. I'm not going to fix all of that. It's probably not fixable entirely. But the school is a start. She studied him. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the person in this valley I most owe the telling to, he said simply. She thought about that. About what it cost a man like Kent to say it, and whether the cost made it more or less meaningful. And she concluded that the cost was real, and the meaning was real, and those two things could coexist. The school needs a decent foundation, she said. The current building heaves every spring. Whatever you build it on proper footings. He blinked. He'd apparently been prepared for more emotional territory and found himself instead in structural engineering. I'll have someone look at it. Wyatt knows foundations. Could ask him. A pause. This was a more complicated suggestion, and they both knew it. Cole, he said. He's the best builder in this valley, she said. That's just a fact. Kent was quiet for a moment. I'll ask him, he said. She found out later, from Wyatt, that Kent had asked and Wyatt had said yes, which had required its own private negotiation between two men who had significant reasons to distrust each other and had both decided that being useful in the present mattered more than being righteous about the past. It was not a warm working relationship, but it was a functional one, and they both showed up when they said they would, and the foundation got built correctly. That was, in its limited way, something. It was Emma who precipitated the conversation that everything had been quietly building toward for months. It was a Saturday in late May, the kind of day that Montana occasionally produced, as if apologizing for winter warm and clear, the creek running high and bright from snowmelt, everything visibly alive in the specific urgent way of northern springs. Emma and Samuelson by the creek and had come back muddy and was set in Wyatt suggested this tested the boundary between near the creek and in the creek several times. Sarsa had gotten them cleaned up, and they were now in the kitchen eating the biscuits she'd made, and Emma was telling a story about a bird she'd seen that had involved considerable theatrical reconstruction of the bird's behavior and probable motivations. Most of its windows were dark. Sarah was listening and not listening, the way you did when something was familiar and comfortable, when the room just felt right in a way you didn't analyze. Emma paused in the middle of the bird story. She looked at Sarah with the direct, clear gaze that she'd had since she was 8 years old, and that showed no signs of moderating. Do you love my dad? She said. The kitchen went quiet. Samuel stopped chewing. Sarah felt her hands go still over whatever she'd been doing. Emma, she said carefully. I'm just asking, Emma said. She wasn't being provocative. She was being Emma, which meant she'd thought of a question and asked it because that was what you did with questions. That's a very personal question. I know. Emma picked up her biscuit again. He loves you. He doesn't say it, but he thinks about you all the time. I can tell because he gets a certain face. She demonstrated a face that was apparently her impression of her father thinking, which involved a furrowed brow and a slightly unfocused gaze. He does that face a lot. Samuel was looking between Emma and Sarah with enormous interest. Think, Sarah said, choosing words with the care of someone crossing ice. That's something your father and I need to talk about. Not you. Okay, Emma said, unperturbed. She went back to the bird story. Sarah stood at the counter and breathed through her nose and thought, that child. She also thought, she's not wrong. She'd known for some time, in the way you knew things you hadn't decided to act on, yet the way Wyatt's voice had become part of the furniture of her days, the specific quality of ease she felt when he was in the room versus when he wasn't, the way she noticed his absence more than she'd been admitting to herself. She'd been careful with it. She'd handled it the way she handled things that required careful handling at arm's length with attention, without rushing. But Emma had a point, and Sarah was 36 years old and had spent enough of her life being careful. She waited until the children were busy and found Wyatt in the barn. He was working on the wagon wheel that had been giving trouble since March, crouched over it with the focused quiet of someone doing something that required more attention than it should. He looked up when she came in. Emma asked me if I love you, she said. He went very still. Then he set down the tool in his hand slowly. She said you get a face. Sarah leaned against the barn post. Apparently a specific face when you're thinking about me. Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck. I'm going to have a conversation with that girl. Are you going to tell her she was wrong? A long pause. He looked at the wagon wheel. He looked at the wall. He looked at her. No, he said. The word landed in the space between them, and they both felt the weight of it. Wyatt, she said. I know, he said. I know the timing is. I know there's James. I know it's been 9 months, she said. And he's not here. And he's not coming back. She said it without cruelty, just plainly, the way she'd learned to say true things that were hard. I love James. I'll always love James. That's not the same as being done with living. He looked at her with an expression she'd seen pieces of before, but never all at once. Everything at the surface. All the careful, controlled management of himself set aside. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time to be somewhere and had finally arrived and wasn't quite sure he was allowed to stay. I'm not a simple man, he said. I've got a temper I work at. There are things I don't talk about easily. I'm better at showing up than at saying things. I know that, she said. I've been watching you for 6 months. You deserve to know what you're getting into, Wyatt. She waited until he met her eyes. You rebuilt my barn. You stood in the road, in the cold, and didn't make it charity. You held my son's cut hands and told him it was okay to say something hurt. You rode into a tornado with me to help a man who had tried to take everything I had. She paused. I know what I'm looking at. He crossed the barn. He didn't rush it. He walked to where she was standing, and he stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly, and he looked at her with that unperformed face, the real one, the one that had nothing left in it, that was managed or constructed. I'm not James, he said. No, she agreed, you're not. He reached up and touched her face just briefly, just his rough, work-scarred hand against her cheek, and it was the first time he'd touched her with anything other than functional intention, and she felt it in every nerve in her body. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. There were no speeches. That was right. Somehow that it should happen plainly, in a barn, 2 worn-out people with complicated histories and imperfect children, and a great deal of work still ahead of them, deciding together to stop pretending they hadn't already decided. She told the boys that evening, all 3 of them together after dinner. She sat them down, and she told them that she and Wyatt had talked, and that they had feelings for each other, and that this was going to mean some changes, and she wanted to be straight with them about it before anything else happened. Marcus said immediately, I knew it. I said so. At dinner that time. You asked an inappropriate question at dinner that time, Sarah said. There's a difference. But I was right. You were not wrong. D'Angelo was quiet. He had the look she'd learned over these months, the look that meant he was processing something that required time, that going at it too directly would cause him to close up rather than open. She waited. Samuel looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, Does this mean Emma's going to be here all the time? That's a possibility, Sarah said. How do you feel about that? Samuel thought about it with the genuine seriousness he brought to most things, now that he was talking again. Good, he said. She's good at being here. Daniel looked up. He looked at his mother for a long moment. Does he make you happy? He said. He asked it directly, the way he'd been learning to do things direct, honest, doing the person the credit of a real question. She thought about it honestly, because he deserved honest and not managed. Yes, she said, he does. Not in a simple way, but yes. Daniel nodded. He picked up his fork and went back to his plate. "'Kay," he said. She looked at him. "That's it? What do you want me to say, Mama?" He looked up, and there was something in his face she'd seen before, something older, something that had worked through a door she hadn't known he'd reached yet. Good man. He's been here every day. He taught me how to build things that don't fall down. He paused. Dad would have wanted you to be okay. He said that to me once. He said if anything happened to him, the most important thing was that we all kept going, and you stayed okay. He looked back down. I think this is you staying okay. She had to look at the ceiling for a moment. James said that to you, she said. Last winter. When he was sick. Before, yeah. She didn't know this. She hadn't known James had said it. She sat with the fullness of that, the man she'd loved preparing her sons for something he'd known might come, giving their grief something to hold on to in advance. Thank you for telling me, she said. Daniel shrugged with the particular economy of teenage boys who have said something important and need to normalize the air after it. Are there more potatoes? She gave him the potatoes. Wyatt talked to Daniel separately the next day. She didn't ask him to. He did it on his own, found Daniel in the barn and sat with him, and she didn't know exactly what was said because she didn't ask, and any of them told her in detail. What she knew was that Daniel came in afterward with the look of a boy who had said hard things and had been heard, and that at dinner Wyatt said something that made Daniel almost laugh. Almost. Because he was 14 and full dignity was required in most situations, and she thought, whatever was said, it was the right thing. Wyatt asked her to marry him in June. It was not, and she would not have wanted it to be a grand gesture. They were sitting on the porch after the boys were in bed, and Emma was asleep in the small room that had somehow become her room over the course of 6 months, and the evening was warm, and the creek was audible in the distance, and the stars over Montana were doing what Montana stars did in June, which was to be aggressively, almost offensively magnificent. He said, I've been thinking about asking you to marry me. She looked at him. That's different from asking. I'm getting there. He was quiet for a moment. I want to be clear about what I'm asking. I'm not asking to take over. I'm not asking to replace anything or anyone. I'm asking to do this together properly. To be here in a way that's formal and settled and permanent. He looked at her. To stop going home every night to a separate place. She thought about the separate place. The cabin he went back to were dark. The cabin he went back to every night, the quiet of it. The two of them living 20 minutes apart and conducting what was already essentially a shared life at arm's length, because the formal step hadn't been taken. I have 3 boys, she said, and a preserve business and a debt to Gertrude Hess, and a complicated relationship with almost everyone in this town. I know. And you have a daughter who asks adults directly whether they're in love with each other. I'm aware. And we fight sometimes. We're going to fight more. I know that too. She looked at the stars for a moment. She thought about James. She always thought about James at the important moments. And she'd stopped feeling guilty about it. And she'd stopped feeling guilty about it. Stopped feeling like it was disloyalty to Wyatt and started understanding it as just the truth of who she was. She loved a man and lost him, and she carried him. That didn't leave. But it had found a place inside her that wasn't in the way of anything. It was just part of the landscape. Now. Like the mountains were part of the landscape, permanent and present, and not requiring constant acknowledgement. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. He let out a breath. A long breath. Like something he'd been holding for longer than just this conversation. He reached over and took her hand and held it. And she let him. And they sat on the porch and listened to the creek. Emma's going to be insufferable about this, he said. Deeply, Sarah agreed. Emma was, in fact, insufferable about it in the best possible way. She announced it to Samuel the next morning before anyone had said anything, officially, having apparently intuited the outcome from some combination of her father's face and the general atmospheric evidence. And Samuel had nodded, like it confirmed something he'd already marked as likely, and the two of them had proceeded to plan the conk in detail over breakfast, incorporating several elements that were impractical, and one that was actively dangerous involving a pony. The wedding was in July. It was not an elaborate thing. It was not meant to be. They held it at the Mitchell property, the barn that Wyatt had rebuilt, standing as both backdrop and evidence. The door frames true and the east wall solid. The whole structure a physical record of what the past 7 months had been. Gertrude Hess came. Aro, the Finnish dry goods man, came and brought his wife, who shook Sarah's hand with both of hers and said something in Finnish that Aro translated as she says, "You're a sensible woman," which is the best thing she says about anyone. Clara Hofstede came and cried, which surprised everyone, including Clara. The Galbraith family came. Pollard came. Several families from the surrounding valley came. Some of them people Sarah had barely spoken to before the storm, and some of them people who had been part of the original closing of doors, and who showed up now with the awkward sincerity of people trying to put something back they'd broken. Reverend Clayton performed the ceremony. He did it quietly and without flourish, which was not his natural register, but which he seemed to understand was appropriate. He'd changed over these months in ways that were small and visible. A certain careful quality had replaced some of the automatic authority, the look of a man who had recalibrated what he was actually for. Warren Kent came. He stood at the edge of the gathering, and he did not impose himself, and he brought nothing except himself, which was the right amount. He shook Wyatt's hand briefly before the ceremony and said something Sarah couldn't hear. And Wyatt nodded without particular warmth, but without hostility either, which was the best available version of that particular interaction, and everyone understood it. Daniel stood beside his mother during the ceremony. He'd asked to, which had surprised her. She'd expected him to want the relative anonymity of the gathered guests, the comfortable distance of a 14-year-old who didn't want to be too visibly emotional in public. But he'd asked to stand with her, and so he did, tall and serious in the jacket he'd grown into over the winter, his father's jaw and his own steady eyes. When Clayton asked if anyone had anything to say before the vows, a formality mostly, a moment that usually passed in silence, Daniel said, quietly and clearly, "I do." The gathering went still. He looked at Wyatt. He held the look. "My dad taught me that you judge people by what they do when it costs them something," he said. "When it would be easier not to. You showed up when it cost you. You kept showing up." He paused. "I'm not saying you're my father. I know you're not my father. But you're someone worth having here. And I think my mom chose right." There were several people in that gathering who had been maintaining composure successfully and stopped doing so at various points during this speech. Wyatt held Daniel's gaze. He said, "I know I'm not your father. I'm not trying to be. But I want you to know I see who you are and I'm proud to know you." He paused. "That's not a thing I say easy." Daniel nodded. His jaw was the complicated kind of set that meant he was doing the thing where you feel everything, and show some of it because some of it was okay now. Sarah held herself together by a margin she would not have been able to quantify. They said their vows. Simple ones, they'd written them themselves, which had taken 3 drafts and 1 argument about language, and 1 evening where they'd both ended up laughing at how impossible it was to say true things in the right order. What they arrived at was plain and honest, and not particularly poetic, which was exactly right for 2 people who had never once, in all the months they'd known each other, been less than honest at the expense of the eases of it. After there was food, Sarah's preserves featured, a fact that Gertrude pointed out to anyone who'd listen, claiming partial credit with the unembarrassed satisfaction of someone who had helped build something and wanted it acknowledged. There was music from a fiddle player the Galbraith family had brought. Marcus danced with a complete disregard for technique that was somehow not embarrassing but endearing. Samuels danced with Emma, who led, because Emma always led in matters of physical coordination. Wyatt danced with Sarah badly, which she'd expected because she'd watched him move through the world for 7 months, and dancing was clearly not among the things he knew how to do with his body, but he held her properly and stayed in approximately the right relationship to the rhythm, and it was enough. The evening wound down the way good evenings did gradually. Peacefully, people drifting toward home in the long summer light, voices getting quieter, the gathering folding itself up without drama. Kent left before dark. He found Sarah briefly on the edge of the gathering, and he said, "I hope you'll be happy." He said it without the undertow of things unsaid, which was perhaps the most meaningful version of the statement he was capable of. She thought it was probably the most honest thing he'd said to her. "I intend to be," she said. That fall, the preserve business expanded in a way that required hiring properly, not just Clara, 1 or 2 days a week, but 3 women from the valley working regular hours, which meant Sarah spent as much time managing people as making preserves, which was a new and occasionally maddening challenge that required different skills than she'd needed before. She was not naturally a manager. She tended toward doing things herself because she knew exactly how she wanted them done, and the adjustment to trusting other people's hands on her work was slow and imperfect, and occasionally involved biting her tongue hard enough to mark it. Clara was good at smoothing this. She had a social intelligence Sarah lacked, and she deployed it quietly, without making Sarah feel managed, which Sarah appreciated precisely because she noticed it. Wyatt finished the schoolhouse foundation in September. The building went up in October, a real building, solid with decent windows and a proper stove, and enough room for the valley's children without anyone having to sit in the aisle. The teacher Kent hired was a young woman from Billings named Miss Farrow who had strong opinions about reading and mathematics, and a complete inability to be intimidated by 11-year-old boys, which made her exactly right for Marcus, who had met his match in her and was the better for it. Daniel, that fall, began working with Wyatt on construction jobs, formally not as an apprentice exactly, but as a second man who was paid half wages and whose opinion was asked on structural questions and whose answers were taken seriously. He was 15 by then, still growing, still working through the complicated ongoing project of who he was, but the shape of it was clearer. He was going to build things. He had his father's hands and a patience that was entirely his own, and a teacher who told him the truth about what he didn't know without making him feel small for not knowing it. He told Sarah once, that fall, that he thought he understood now what Wyatt had meant about buildings, about how they lasted. "What do you mean?" she asked. He said last winter when we were doing the east wall, he said the thing that makes a building last isn't the materials. It's whether the people who built it were paying attention. He thought about it. I think he was talking about more than buildings. I think he probably was, she said. Samuel, by the end of that first year, was unremarkable at school in the best possible way. Not a child anyone worried about. Not a child anyone flagged. Just a boy who liked maps and animals, and his best friend Emma, and had a lot to say about most things. The silence of the winter felt very far away. Sarah sometimes thought about it, the months when he hadn't spoken, when she'd watched him move through grief without the words to describe it, and she felt the distance between that and this as a kind of quiet gratitude that had no clean expression, but lived in her chest whenever she watched him. Emma was by any measure a force of nature. She had decided, at some point in the spring, that the Mitchell-Cole household was simply her natural habitat and had organized herself accordingly. She knew where everything was, had opinions about how things should be arranged, taught Samuel to whistle, and taught Marcus a card game of questionable origin, and informed Wyatt with some regularity about aspects of his own personality that she felt he should be aware of. Wyatt received these assessments with the particular patience of a man who had raised this child alone and understood that certain things about her were simply weather. The valley changed slowly. Not completely, there were still people who held distances, still undercurrents of the old judgments that didn't disappear because a storm had happened and some apologies had been made. Real things didn't fix that cleanly, but the texture of it was different. School was a common project. The storm had made a shared vocabulary of effort. People who had stood on opposite sides of Sarah Mitchell's survival had worked beside each other in the aftermath and found that being on the same side of something practical was easier than they'd expected. It wasn't peace, exactly. It was more like practice. The valley practicing at something it hadn't been good at, doing it imperfectly and trying again. On a morning in November of that first married year, Serapha woke before dawn and lay for a moment in the dark. The house was quiet, the children's breathing the only sound, and Wyatt's beside her, slow and even, the breathing of someone who worked genuinely hard and slept accordingly. The room was cold at the edges and warm where they were, and through the window the first gray of pre-dawn was beginning. She thought, as she sometimes did in these early minutes, about the morning 11 months ago when she had walked into Mercy Creek with her 3 boys and the temperature had been 11 below zero, and Harold Briggs had thrown that bolt. She thought about it not with the sick lurch it had once produced, but with the different quality of a thing that had happened, a thing that had been the first in a long chain of things that had led her here, to this room, to this life. She had not asked for what happened to her. She had not asked to be widowed, to be abandoned by a town she'd trusted, to spend a winter fighting for things that should never have required fighting for. None of that had been fair, and she'd made peace with the unfairness of it in the only way that actually worked, which was to stop expecting the world to be fair and start asking only what she was going to do with what the world actually was. What she had done was this, all of this. She thought about what her sister had written in a letter the previous spring, before she knew about Wyatt, before the storm, when the note had just been paid. Her sister had asked, "How do you keep going when everything is against you?" She hadn't answered that letter for a week, because she didn't know how to explain it. And then she'd written, "I stopped trying to find a reason that made it fair. I just got up and did the next thing. And then the next person who needed something did something for me. And it turned out that was enough to build on." It was a simple answer. It was also the most true thing she knew. Wyatt shifted beside her. He didn't wake up, just moved in his sleep and settled again. She listened to his breathing return to its slow, even rhythm. She thought about Marcus' question at the dinner table, "Are you going to just keep eating dinner here forever, or are you going to be our family?" And she thought about how the world had answered that, had answered it not once and cleanly, but in accumulation, day by day, jar by jar, wall by wall, the answer arriving so gradually that she'd almost missed the moment it became definitively yes. She had not built the life she'd planned. She'd built something else messier, harder, more populated with difficult people and complicated feelings and work that never fully ended. Most of its windows were dark. But there was something she'd learned about the difference between the life you plan and the life you build. The planned life was always clean because it was imaginary, because it didn't have mud season or a cracked tool or a 14-year-old with grief in his jaw, and the built life was never clean because it was real, and real things accumulated weather and history and the mark of hands. She would take the built life. She had the built life. She got up carefully and went downstairs and made coffee. Kitchen was cold, and she stoked the stove and stood with her hands around the cup and looked out the window at the valley, coming up slowly out of the dark. The frost on the glass, making the view soft-edged and strange. The barn was there, solid in the growing light. The schoolhouse was there 2 miles distant, a shape on the hill. The road that curved through the valley, past the Galbraith place, and the Homestead Ranch, and the rebuilt Kent outbuildings, past every place that held some piece of what the past year had been. She heard boots on the stairs. Wyatt appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair still disordered from sleep, one of his flannel shirts half-buttoned the way it was when he dressed in the dark. "You're up early," he said. "Always," she said. He came to the stove and poured his own coffee. He stood beside her and looked out the window at what she'd been looking at. They were quiet together, in the way they'd gotten good at the comfortable quiet people who didn't need to fill every silence with something, who had learned that being in the same room was itself a form of conversation. "Galbraith wants a quote on a spring house," he said, after a while. "Are you going to take it?" "Probably. If Daniel wants to work it with me." "He will." "Yeah." He drank his coffee. "He will." The valley was fully light now, the sun coming over the eastern ridge in that particular low-angle November way that turned everything gold and made even the difficult parts of the landscape look bearable. The frost on the window had started to clear from the edges, the view sharpening. She thought about the woman who had walked into Harold Briggs' store with $17 and 3 hungry sons and had the door bolted against her, and she thought about the distance between that morning and this one. And the distance was enormous, and also, strangely, honestly not as far as she might have expected. Because the woman who had walked into that store was also her, still her. The same stubbornness, the same refusal, the same bedrock quality that had gotten her out of that store and down that road and through every hard thing after it. She hadn't become someone different. She'd become more of who she already was. That was the thing nobody told you about survival. It didn't make you new. It made you more specifically yourself. She heard the first sounds of children, waking Marcus's voice first. Of course, Marcus, who greeted each morning as if it required immediate narration, and then Emma's answering voice from her room, and then Samuel's quieter sounds, and distantly Daniel moving in his usual unhurried way. A morning. An ordinary morning. She had fought for months, through cold and hunger, and a town's judgment, and a powerful man's pressure, and a tornado, and her own grief, and the fear that all of it would not be enough. She had fought for ordinary mornings, for coffee in a warm kitchen, for the sound of her children waking up safe. She had them now. She knew how much they were worth. Wyatt finished his coffee and set the cup down. He looked at her. Just looked the way he did sometimes, the direct, honest look that she'd learned to read as his particular version of saying something important. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said back. She turned to start breakfast. The children would be down soon, and there was work, and there was always work, and the day was already becoming what days became when you lived them properly: full, complicated, imperfect, ongoing. The kind of day that required you and gave something back in return. Outside the window, the valley spread out in the morning light, all of it, the hard parts and the beautiful parts, the repaired things and the things still waiting to be repaired, the road that went through it and came back around, the barn that had been rebuilt and the school on the hill, and the smoke starting to rise from chimneys all along the creek as the valley woke up and started again. Mercy Creek, her home, the place that had tried to turn her out and had found in the end that she was the kind of person who stayed. She cracked the first egg. The day began.